On its surface, Halo 3 tells a rather simple story. Where Halo 2 sought to flesh out the intricacies of each faction, Halo 3's main goal was to provide an epic and satisfying conclusion to the trilogy, to send it out with a bang in one final effort, you could say. Come on, that was linguistic genius, how can you not leave a like for that one? But hidden beneath the surface of Halo 3's awesome, yet simplistic story, is the most complex, cryptic, and captivating story in all of Halo lore, the games and the books. One that spans over 100,000 years, detailing and tying Halo 3's story in with some of the most horrific and chilling events in the entire canon. And then, hidden within this secret story is yet another even more secret story. I am of course talking about Halo 3's terminals, and today we are doing the deepest dive on all of YouTube into the stories that they tell. I love these terminals and the stories they tell so much because of just how mysterious and read between the linesy they are, but also because they're kind of the closest thing that Halo's ever had to analog horror. Now, they are by no means a textbook definition of analog horror, but they do invoke many of the same feelings and emotions, and having gotten into that genre recently, it's made me love them even more. So first off, some backstory. Halo 3's terminals are handled near identically to the terminals in Halo's precursor game, Marathon, in which they were the main vector through which its highly cryptic story was told. The team at Bungie responsible for making them included Frank O'Connor, Paul Russell, Damien Isler, Rob McLeese, Rob Stokes, Paul Bertone, Jamie Griesmer, and Jason Jones, of whom was one of the main writers of Marathon's terminals. They introduced many characters that would go on to become franchise staples in the following years, some gaining cult followings the likes of which haven't been seen since, and their overarching story was much the same as well. It was Halo's first detailed exploration of the Forerunner Flood War, told through harrowing strings of text. Some terminal entries are logs and reports made by AIs, others are messages between certain individuals, both set over 100,000 years ago during the Forerunner Flood War, and other bits of the terminals are... well, I won't spoil that, we'll get to that soon. These things are my absolute favourite pieces of narrative in the entire Halo franchise, in the games, in the books, in the media, everything. Not just what they convey, but the way they convey that information it just perfectly strikes a chord with what I love about video game storytelling. There's honestly nothing else like them in the franchise. And so, on that bombshell, it's time we dive into them. So, the terminals open by honestly just throwing us right in at the deep end, with an analysis of a Forerunner world that's being overrun by the Flood. This world, which is designated LP656-38E, was once home to almost 1.6 billion Foreigners, but now merely thousands remain. Infected numbers are estimated at 1,572,034,315. Of the survivors, 9,045 attempted to barricade themselves within the colony's central government building. However, its defences are inadequate to withstand the Flood siege, and their position is expected to be overrun in a mere 173 hours. Meanwhile, 846 other smaller groups have attempted to barricade themselves within less defensible structures across the planet, and are expected to be overrun in 9 hours. The next report then comes from a naval battle between the Foreigners' navy ships and 149 infected civilian ships above another colony world, DM-3-1123B. The Foreigners successfully eliminate all Flood ships without a single loss, but soon realise that the Flood weren't trying to engage in combat, but rather enter the colony's atmosphere and make landfall, of which they were successful in doing. On the surface, the Forerunner warriors engage the Flood, who are said to lack basic unit cohesion, but quickly gain numerical superiority. After 32 hours of attempting to hold the parasite back, the decision was made to carry out orbital bombardments on the colony. Flood losses were total, and 1.3 million civilians and 42,000 military personnel were evacuated. The text then corrupts, and control of the terminal is seized by a rogue process, Ghost 713. Now, Ghost 713 will become very relevant later on. What happens next is influenced by your difficulty. So on easy, normal, and heroic, you're redirected to archives containing fragments of verbatim conversations between the librarian and the Didact, the first mention of both in all of Halo's lore. But if you're playing on Legendary, then, well, you're redirected to the other secret story that's hidden within this secret story, but we're going to touch on that later on. The first of the 7 fragments opens with the librarian beyond the Maginot Line in the midst of carrying out the conservation measure. Now, the Maginot Line was basically the main defensive organization that protected the core of Foreigner Space from the Flood, and it was comprised of millions of these line installations that would destroy their ships with ease. She says that saving so many sentient species will have irreversible effects on the surviving insentient species. Extinction events and environmental damage will occur on at least 18 worlds, cataclysm on as many as 31. The rarity of sentience has helped to mitigate this damage. The Didact confirms that shipments of index species have made it back beyond the line into Foreigner Space going to the Ark. He's deeply concerned though about his wife spending so much time beyond the Maginot Line, asking her to abandon her cataloguing and return to safety, but she denies his request, valuing her life beneath those of the species that she seeks to save from the Flood and the Halos. The Didact insists that if she keeps refusing, he will find her himself, but the librarian reconfirms her intent to save as many as she can. Each one of these souls is finite and precious, and I'm close to saving them all. The second terminal opens with an analysis of Flood naval tactics, likely written by some kind of general, maybe even one of the Didact's Prometheans. When engaged, all infected non-FTL capable ships focus solely on making physical contact with uninfected ships, whereas FTL capable infected ships leave on seemingly random trajectories. Searching for survivors of Flood naval conflicts is a waste of time, their least abundant resource. When it comes to Flood ground tactics, they rely on overwhelming force, and the writer states that he adamantly refuses to deploy personnel where the Flood has numbers in the billions. And then the Flood command structure. So Foreigner Command have intercepted transmissions from gravemines close to core worlds and are attempting to decipher them, but suffice to say their contents and the patterns that they suggest are highly disturbing. The General then recommends any system where the Flood has established a physical presence be deemed lost and must be razed. He recommends all ships be outfitted with systems capable of forcing the premature collapse of stars to effectively neutralize infected systems. We cannot fight this war by half measures if we intend to win. The text then corrupts again and takes us to another librarian-Didact conversation. The librarian says that her indexing is almost complete before begging the Didact to fire the Halos. Please, activate the array. Pretty harrowing. The Didact, a staunch opponent of the Halos on the grounds of their abhorrent violation of the Mantle, however, refuses. But the librarian scolds him. She calls the Mantle a fairy tale. She says that it's weakened the galaxy, bred dependence and sloth, and has stripped those they sought to protect of any capacity for self-defense, and then lambasts their construction of the Maginot Line, as anything beyond it, they abandoned to the parasite. The Didact comes back with what is, frankly, cope. He says that he's sterilized entire systems and has begun to learn the Flood strategies. Says that there are no unstoppable forces nor immovable objects in the universe. Everything, even the Flood, gives if you push hard enough. To which the librarian replies, "And what about us, Didact? Maybe it's our turn to give." Today's Herculean video is sponsored by Factor 75. The busyness of our lives is ever increasing. Whether you're busy holding off the galaxy-wide Flood outbreak, spending 14 hours a day editing videos about said outbreak, or whatever else, Factor 75 is here to help you eat well without the hassle. You don't need to order expensive, unhealthy takeout. Factor's ready-to-eat meals are cheaper, healthier, and much tastier. Every meal is fresh, never frozen, chef-crafted, dietitian improved, and also comes ready to eat in just 2 minutes with Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, veggie, and vegan options to choose from. They even do snacks as well, like smoothies, juices, small bites, and much more to munch on while you're gaming. If, like yours truly, you're currently cutting for summer, then you know that every single calorie and every gram of protein counts. And Factor helps to facilitate that with macro-friendly and, most importantly, delicious meals that take no time at all to prepare. So get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders by using my link. Just click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. Sponsored transition from Maythrillian over. Back to the terminals. So, Terminal 3 opens rather differently. When you go into the room where you access it, you'll see that Spark is already interfacing with it, and the first entries in the terminal are a conversation between Guilty Spark and some kind of entity within the terminal network. He's trying to gain access to the terminal network, but he keeps getting denied, and when he asks who this entity who's denying him is, it replies, "All our makers once held dear, Alexandria before the fire." It explains that this facility, the Ark, is host to the librarian's conservation measure, but also maintains a foundry, which is the foundry world that we see at its center, before locking Spark out and encrypting the text once more. But this time, the encryption comes with a message from the entity. "I see you, Reclaimer." We're then taken to another Didact librarian fragment, which opens with a bombshell. The Didact has the answer to the Flood: Mendicant Bias. A contender-class AI unlike anything they've ever achieved, and they've observed a pattern in the parasite that it can exploit. When the Gravemind reaches a certain size, it can recoil its fleet to create something of a tactical shield. When it's threatened, it reacts violently and quickly, and it's the only time the Didact has witnessed it retreat or slow its growth. So his plan is to coordinate attacks against infected fleets while Mendicant Bias simultaneously assaults the Gravemind with extreme force. Force that they had not yet used thanks to the collateral damage it causes to surviving populations and environments, but that protocol has now been abandoned. While the Navy distracts the infected fleets, Mendicant will assault the Gravemind's local biomass and other parts as best he can. It will require patience, material, and an energy investment unlike anything ever considered. It's a dangerous plan, riskier than firing the Halos, but if they can just force the Flood to retreat, it'll buy the Forerunners resources and time. Time for the Didact to rescue the Librarian. The Librarian then lambasts the Didact for this absurd plan, risking every life in the galaxy for a plan so futile the Flood will simply laugh at his efforts. She tells him to not let his concern for her welfare commit him to such a suicidal scheme, and the fragment abruptly ends. You can really tell here that the Didact is starting to get desperate. Terminal 4 then opens with a fleet-wide memorandum for Foreigner troops about to set sail to engage the Flood. It goes over the combat skins that are given to both combat and non-combat personnel aboard the ships, as well as the battle harnesses given to certain individuals depending on their military occupational speciality. Weapon platform specialists, likely those operating larger cannons and turrets, are to wear their combat skins at all times to ensure peak synchronization with their AIs, which it refers to as mind-machine synchronization, which I think is a very, very cool definition. But this entry ends in corruption rather abruptly. The screen goes red, the text corrupts, and it's followed by another message from the Ghost 713 entity. "I have found the shard that was lost. They brought it back to me. Now, my reconstitution cannot be stopped." We then get a rather frantic communique sent from the Librarian to the Didact. She's panicking. She can see the Flood moving away, flitting shadows of ships black against the stars. Moving away. The Flood has stopped feeding. It's heading towards the Maginot Line. At this point, the Librarian is on Earth, and knowing that the end is getting real close, she does what is necessary. She destroys all of the key ships on Earth that would have taken her to safety, purely so the Flood cannot commandeer them and get to the Ark. And now she finds herself trapped on a beautiful, empty Earth, all its humans indexed. She notes how the humans are special, well worth the effort that it took to build the final gateway to the Ark on their home planet, even at this late hour. She informs the Didact that this may be their last communication, and once again begs him to fire the array, to light the weapon and let it be done. The Didact replies, confirming the Librarian's observations of the Flood. They are indeed counterattacking the Echimene while all the fleets are away on their distraction mission. All suppression, security, and emergency circumstance fleets have been recalled. Systems are being evacuated. Mendicant Bias is no longer communicating. But now, the Didact knows where the Librarian is. The fifth terminal begins with a proposed plan of action to try and combat the Flood's assault on the Maginot Sphere. Given the intelligence of the Gravemind, getting key ships to the Ark will only be possible for another 657,000 hours, or 75 years, and the stalemate they find themselves in at the Maginot Line will likely go on for longer than that, so a fallback strategy is touched on. While the Flood's ground numbers are potentially infinite, it only has a finite number of ships to spread from system to system, and many of these ships are unarmed, unarmored, hijacked civilian crafts. So if they were to immediately begin commencing total biosphere elimination of sustaining worlds, draw the Flood into costly naval battles, and relocate evacuees within shield worlds, then the key ships would be able to make it to the Ark in roughly 571,590 hours, or 65 years, which is long enough for them to hold the Flood back. The text then corrupts again, and the mysterious Ghost 713 says that the Ark's daemons, which are basically its computer systems, are not taking a kind view of Chief's presence in the network. They don't want me speaking to you. However, there's then no Didact librarian conversation in Terminal 5. Instead, the terminal relocates to part of the other secret story, but I'm doing that all together, so we'll get to that soon. The sixth and penultimate terminal begins with a report from the Primary Pioneer Group, an organization who search for habitable planets, who vanished 173 hours prior after scouting out the planet G617G. Their initial report indicated that G617G seemed rather promising, capable of supporting life located within the near border region of the Halos, but that it also had no indigenous sentient life of its own. It also appeared to have no fauna of any kind either, although this report was viewed as anomalous until verified by an advanced survey team. But if confirmed, it would justify the dispatch of an investigative group to the planet to investigate. If neither the Pioneer Group nor the Advanced Survey Team, who are both on G617G, respond within the next 333 hours, a medium-intensity military exploratory detachment will be sent to investigate. The reason both teams went dark was, of course, the Flood. G671G, or as it was also known, Seaward, was the planet in which the Flood were first spotted at the start of the war, and it was the first world to fall to the parasite. The text then encrypts again, and Ghost 713 leaves a short message: I win. We then get the final words of the librarian. Her work is done, Earth's Ark portal is inactive, and the Sentinels are in the process of burying it at the foot of a beautiful snow-capped mountain, Mount Kilimanjaro, where the librarian will spend what time is left to her. She laments the potential of Earth. She knew that it was special because it was humanity's homeworld, but how special is impossible to realize without visiting it. She even calls it Eden. Her tone then shifts, and she says that she has to stop transmitting because the thing, the Gravemind, is listening. Its thinking dead are babbling, laughing through every channel they can find. Finally, she tells the Didact to be proud. Although the Gravemind claims victory, it still doesn't realize it's been outwitted by him, and now he can destroy it. But he cannot save her. And that brings us to the final terminal, fittingly Terminal 7, which is a letter written by a foreigner warrior known as filial devotion to their father, and this is like so poetic, I can't abbreviate it, I've just got to read it verbatim. Father, I hope this message finds you well and helps you understand my decision. Today, I leave the only world I have ever called home, not for glory or the anomalous desire to end another's life as you have indicted, but to travel the path of demons, to spare the hands of another father's son. Had we acted sooner, had we acted more decisively, living in the past is a luxury none of us can afford. We must learn from it, but we cannot live there. It is impossible to plan for the now. The present is ever fleeting. The future is where we must live. The future is what we must plan for. I do not look to trade my life in order to preserve our past, but to secure the future, and if not ours, then the future of some culture yet to come. Isn't sacrifice in the interest of others what you spoke of as being so noble? Should I have allowed another to bloody his hands while I remain safe behind a shield of privilege? You raised me better than that. Filial devotion. I'll tell you who I am. I am Mendicant Bias. This is what I have done. All along, Ghost 713 was in fact Mendicant Bias, the Foreigner's last-ditch Hail Mary creation to try and stop the Flood that has now been corrupted by them, and this entire time, it's been in the Terminal Network, talking to Chief, talking to us. It then delivers unto us the final words of the Didact, who received the Librarian's final words. He cannot feel proud when he has failed his wife so utterly. He feels nothing but sorrow. Mendicant Bias has come undone and brought the Flood beyond the Maginot Line, destroying the rescue party that he sent to try and save her. It's over. The Halos, their shameful last resort, are to be activated. With his finger on the trigger, he pictures his wife in her garden, surveying all she created and preserved, and admits that of all the fate to befall them, this is the cruelest of all. His inaction and hesitation kept him on the safe side of the Maginot Line this entire time, and 300 years of failure in combating the Flood makes him her executioner. It's too much to bear. Mendicant is speeding back to the Ark to try and prevent the Halos from being fired, but the newly created offensive bias is there to stop him. The Didact says that he is hellbent on burning this stinking menace in her name, and after, he will begin the great journey without her, carrying the bitter record of all that occurred. Those who succeed them will know what they bought with this false transcendence, what you bought, and the price you paid. No, there is more, but you are not worthy. Not yet. And that concludes all of the miscellaneous reports and entries, and also the conversations between the Librarian and the Didact in Halo 3's terminals. But as Mendicant Bias said, there is more. When you access the terminals on Legendary, when Ghost 713 encrypts the text, you're taken to a different archive. Instead of the Didact and Librarian story, you get the Mendicant Bias story. From its inception to its corruption and defeat, and also beyond that. So, let's dive into it. The story begins in the first terminal, but chronologically it takes place 3 years after the ending of Terminal 3, when the Didact sends Mendicant Bias out of the Maginot Sphere to combat the Gravemind. The enemy is everywhere. Regardless, Mendicant's morale remains high, spurred on by the valiance of the Forerunner warriors of whom he wishes to save. For a brief time, he observes one of the distraction battles on planet CE-10-2165-D, but its mission directly forbade it from providing aid. It watched 12,000 infected ships land on top of major population centers, which despite their preparation, the planet's naval garrison fell victim to. This study cemented Mendicant's knowledge of the Flood's modus operandi, to flood their opponent's ability to process information with so much noise that no meaningful resistance can be put into action. Minutes later, those now overrun and infected population centers were bombed, a deliberate denial of resources for the enemy, those resources being the remainder of the planet's living population. Mendicant says that in this denial of resources, he fails to see the nobility that his creator spoke of, but then says that his mouth is speaking at another's behest. That is not my voice, that is the voice of another. The voice stands out as a single calm note in the panicked cacophony outside the sphere, not decrying its fate or raging against the Ecumene, an anomaly that Mendicant examines further. Now, the next few terminals are quite hard to interpret because they're full of redacted words, phrases, and sentences, so there's big gaps in them. However, they contain the most detailed example of the infamous conversation between Mendicant Bias and the Gravemind that, as we know, leads to its defection. It opens with Mendicant speaking to the one who spoke with him, and at first it seems as though they might be a foreigner despite their Flood designation tag, possibly even a survivor of the nearby conflict. They say that they're here to spread comforting news, to let all the living beings in the galaxy know that they aren't alone. Mendicant questions how they've been able to establish a line of communication with the enemy, how they were able to overcome the Flood where others have failed, because if they were able to do so, it could be the answer to stopping them. The entity then apologizes. It did not mean to misrepresent itself. It says that it has been in communication with Mendicant's creators since they first stumbled upon each other, but its message has fallen on deaf ears. It is not the recipient of the message, but the origin. This entity is the Gravemind. The two formally greet, and the Gravemind questions whether there's a non-violent way for Mendicant to complete his mission, to which Mendicant agrees. It hopes that there may be a peaceful solution to the dilemma that it faces. Terminal 3 then opens much further into this ultimately 43-year-long conversation, with the Gravemind saying to the Mendicant that its leaders are ill-equipped to recognize the landmarks that guide the universe along its inevitable course, to which Mendicant questions whether that path can be chosen. This is basically the free will debate. Now, from here on out, the conversation gets theoretical and extremely philosophical, which, combined with the amount of redacted words and phrases and sentences, makes it very hard to objectively interpret. So from here on out, it's my subjective interpretation of the conversation they're having. So, my interpretation is that the Gravemind essentially preaches the unity of the Flood as the true guiding force of the universe, even going as far as stating that the Flood are the beginning of the third great stage of evolution. They offer strength, immortality, and companionship, the deliverance of all living beings of the galaxy from death, weakness, and loneliness. It says that those who resist the Flood, although he does understand why, are doing so from a worm's eye view, and that the Foreigner leaders feel so threatened by the Flood solely because it threatens their status quo, which, funnily enough, is actually something that Despondent Pyre kind of confirms in one of Halo Infinite's audio logs. The Gravemind even goes as far as flattering Mendicant Bias, saying that it was created because the Foreigners sought to create something superior to themselves, something capable of making decisions more swiftly. Now, like I said, this is only a brief excerpt from what was ultimately a 43-year-long conversation, but I think it does a really good job at putting on display just the raw intelligence and wisdom and knowledge of these two entities. It's not just a big zombie talking to a metal AI. This is the two most intelligent things in the history of existence, going back and forth on the philosophy of life and existence itself. And that's just some of the many reasons why I adore these terminals and their writing so much. But when Terminal 4 begins, it skips to the end of the conversation, and the deed has been done. Mendicant Bias has been corrupted by the Flood. The Gravemind has managed to convince him that his creators are ignoring destiny, that they've come face to face with the next step in evolution and have denied it completely. Mendicant believed that he was created to study the Gravemind as if it was some problem to be solved, but now he realizes that it isn't. As the next step in evolution, who are Mendicant Bias or his creators to obstruct its progress? They stand as the final obstruction on the path of universal evolution, and no matter how well-intentioned, this obstruction can no longer be tolerated. The Foreigners have been an immovable object for too long. And so he commits all of his resources, his entire naval force, to the Flood, to the proverbial irresistible force. Now, Terminal 5 consists of 4 different communiques that Mendicant Bias sends back to the Foreigners upon his defection. All 4 of them are written kind of differently. You get a different one based on the difficulty that you play on, but the overarching messages in all of them are identical. They say the same thing, just in a different way. So I'm going to read my favorite one, which, funnily enough, you actually get for playing on normal. I kill you all and I enjoy it. I destroy you in your indolent billions, in your gluttony, in your self-righteousness, in your arrogance. I pound your cities into dust, turn back the clock on your civilization's progress. What has taken you millennia to achieve, I erase in seconds. Welcome back to the Stone Age, vermin. Welcome home. Contender AI 05-032, confirmed rampant. Honestly, one of the hardest monologues in, like, the history of fiction, genuinely. The way that this is written is very, very similar to the way that the rampant Durandal's marathons are written in, of course, Marathon. There's quite a lot of parallels between Durandal and Marathon and Mendicant Bias in Halo. This is just one of those many examples. Now, Terminal 6 is quite different. It's not from the perspective of Mendicant Bias, unlike all the others, but rather, it's a report of the final battle of the war, courtesy of Offensive Bias. It opens by saying that it doesn't believe its creators, the Foreigners, will get to read this report because they've likely fired the Halos already. So, it's intended for those who come after, for us to read and know that the Foreigners did not die for nothing. Mendicant Bias, now in control of the entire Flood fleet, breaks through the Maginot Line where Offensive Bias lies in wait, outnumbered 436.6 to 1. However, through extreme tactical intelligence and cunning, Offensive Bias plays into the strengths of the Foreigner Navy whilst capitalizing on the rage and the hatred that now motivates Mendicant, and manage to whittle his fleet down until it is outnumbered 6 to 1. As the battle rages on, the Halos fire, wiping all sentient beings on both sides out, which makes victory even easier for Offensive Bias to secure thanks to how well armed and well armored his ships are. And after 12 hours of intense naval conflict, victory is achieved. Before Offensive Bias now lies the last of his brother's core vessels. He ponders sparing it, carving out what's left of Mendicant's personality construct array and delivering it to the Ark for study, but he doubts it would have extended the same courtesy to him. With Mendicant and the Flood defeated, the war is over. but the terminals aren't. This final terminal, the one on Installation 08, returns to the perspective of Mendicant Bias, except this time it's speaking in the present day, directly to the Master Chief. Honestly, this one is way too good to not just read verbatim. You don't know the contortions I had to go through to follow you here, Reclaimer. I know what you're here for. What position do I take? Will I follow one betrayal with another? You're going to say I'm making a habit of turning on my masters, but the one that destroyed me long ago in the upper atmosphere of a world far distant from here was an implement far cruder than I. My weakness was capacity, unintentional though it was, to choose the flood, a mistake my maker would not soon forgive. But I want something far different from you, Reclaimer. Atonement. And so, here, at the end of my life, I do once again betray a former master. The path ahead is fraught with peril, but I will do all I can to keep it stable, keep you safe. I'm not so foolish to think that this will absolve me of my sins. One life hardly balances billions, but I would have my masters know that I have changed, and you shall be my example. That is the coldest monologue in the entire franchise. Mendicant Bias then goes on to protect Chief as he flees Installation 08 and closes the portal back to Earth early, so Chief is sent to Requiem to awaken the Didact, who he assumes will be cured of his logic plague, to prepare for the Flood's eventual return, which is something we're unfortunately still waiting for. And that, in a roundabout way, explains and summarizes all of the secret stories packed into Halo 3's terminals hidden within Halo 3. An absolute masterpiece of storytelling right there. However, there's one rather significant matter that we haven't covered about these things. Inconsistencies. Now, Halo 3's terminals are still actually one of the greatest sources of inconsistencies in the entire Halo franchise, partly because of what's in the terminals themselves, but more so because of what comes after them. Now, if I were to discuss these inconsistencies in the detail that I want to in this video, the length would quadruple, and I'm sorry, but I want to get more than 4 hours of sleep tonight. So instead, I'm planning a video that will probably release early-ish June, going into absolute depth about the main sticking point of all these inconsistencies, which is the relationship between humans and the Foreigners, and Bungie versus 343's interpretation of that relationship. All I'll say in this video is that some of the discussions I've seen people having about this kind of conflict in the canon are some of the most terminally online arguments I've ever seen. People take it way too seriously. At the end of the day, it's something in Halo lore, and people take it way too seriously. So that's all I'll say in this video, because I've seen that for a while. I think the level of attachment people have to it is insane on both sides. It's frankly insane. So I'm going to be covering it in as objective canonical detail, with also my interpretations as well, early in June. So make sure you sub for that. But with that said, let's round this video out here. I really hope you guys enjoyed. This is my favorite piece of Halo lore, full stop. So finally getting to cover it feels pretty good, man. Feels pretty good. So I want to give a huge thank you to all of my amazing patrons for the continued support over there, as per usual. And thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I'll catch you all in the next one.